Okay, so today we're going to talk about some measurement issues that come up in experimental group research, especially when we're looking at certain behaviors. And to talk about this, it's a good idea to first talk about the difference between context-bound behavior change versus generalized behavior change. So context-bound behavior change is that which occurs as a result of a change in the context. It's referring to a change in your state. So for example, if humans drink several alcoholic beverages, they'll probably exhibit impaired motor skills. In this case, the context is being under the influence of alcohol, and the behavior change is the impaired motor skills. And we don't expect this change to last forever, only as long as the context is in operation. So some of the clues that we've measured a context-bound behavior change is that the behavior readily reverses or it changes as the context changes. So we know that we've measured something to do with state and not a lasting change. And there are times when these sorts of changes are of interest to us in educational research. So for example, we might want children to sit quietly in class during their lecture. So we might test an intervention that teaches them to be quiet, like the good behavior intervention or something. And then we might measure talking during class as our outcome. And in that case, our changes that we want to see, we don't expect them to last forever. We don't expect the children to be quiet permanently or on the playground in a different context. We're just interested in behavior change in that specific context. So that's an educational research example of when our goal might be to facilitate and measure context-bound behavior change. On the other hand, a generalized behavior change refers to a behavior change in a person's skills or abilities. It's more referring to a change in a person's traits. So some clues that a behavior change is generalized is that it doesn't reverse quickly or easily. The behavior is exhibited across multiple contexts or with different interaction partners. It's generally stable from week to week. It's really more referring to a person's traits or their generalized abilities. So for example, if I were to learn to speak another language fluently, that would be a generalized behavior change. So it would be generally stable over time. I wouldn't forget the language from one week to another, and I could exhibit it across multiple contexts. So I could speak to different people in that language or in different settings. So that's an example of a generalized behavior change. It's really more referring to my trait of being able to speak this language. And this is the sort of behavior change that we're often interested in educational research. So for example, we might want to teach kids to read, so we might measure reading with some sort of standardized test or some other measure that measures their generalized ability to read. We don't want to influence a context-bound ability to read. We want to make sure that they can read in all settings and that this reading ability is stable over short periods of time. We wouldn't want or expect that reading ability to change from setting to setting or to go away after only a week. This can be an issue in education research because the way that we measure behavior affects whether we're measuring behavior that's generalized or context-bound. So here's an example from early childhood language intervention literature. When kids aren't exhibiting typical language development, we are concerned for their future social and occupational outcomes. After all, language is important, so we might develop an intervention that we believe will help them acquire language. And since parents are with their children constantly, a parent trained to do an intervention is an ideal agent of change. So we might develop a parent-mediated language intervention for young children with delayed language. We would want to do our best to demonstrate the effectiveness of this parent-mediated intervention, so we would design a good experiment to do so. So to test that, we would randomly sample from the population of young children with language delays and then randomly assign them to either a control or a treatment group. At baseline, we'd measure every child's language during a parent-child free play session. So our outcome variable might be something like number of different words used by the child or number of different communicative gestures initiated by the child during the parent-child interaction. But regardless of whatever variable we chose, we'd make sure to use the same measurement context for both groups at baseline. Then, during intervention, we teach the parents in the treatment group to do certain behaviors that elicit more language from children. For example, we might teach them to engage children around the child's object of interest, or teach them to respond to communication acts made by the child, like vocalizations or gestures. We believe that these parent behaviors will create more opportunities for the parent to give important linguistic information to the child, which can in turn positively affect the child's language ability. Then we'd measure our outcomes in both groups again during a parent-child free play session after a few weeks of intervention. Our outcomes show that kids in the intervention group exhibited more language during their parent-child free play session than kids in the control group, so we conclude that our intervention helped language-delayed children develop their language skills. In other words, we believe that it positively changed their functional language abilities. But there's something that's wrong with our conclusion. Even though we believe the measurement context to be the same for both groups, it's actually different. In the intervention group, the mothers are trained to use behaviors that elicit more language. A parent-child free play session with a mother that is trained to elicit language is not the same context as a parent-child free play session with a mother that isn't trained to. The measurement context in the intervention group has changed from pre to post-intervention because it's now filled with mothers that know how to get their kids to communicate more. Essentially, this is an instrumentation threat to internal validity. What I mean is that the way we chose to measure this outcome introduced systematic error into our results. Measurement error is something that every behavioral researcher has to deal with. It can be random, or it can be systematic. A good way to visualize this is to think of targets. Let's say that the center of the target is the true state of the world, in this case, the actual language abilities of our participants. Each X represents our attempt to measure the true state of the world. In other words, each X is a score for one participant. Our goal is to measure with precision and accuracy such that our results are representative of our participants' true abilities. But all researchers have to deal with measurement error, so if we have error, we would hope that it would be randomly distributed, such that the average result is still roughly accurate and representative of the true state of things. Problems occur when our error is not randomly distributed. In other words, it is systematic error which biases our results in one direction or another. By measuring our language outcome in the parent-child free play context, here is how we introduce systematic error. Mothers in the treatment group will learn to be more uniformly responsive and to elicit more language than mothers in the control group as a result of the treatment. Mothers in the control group will be more varied in their responses because their interaction styles will not be altered. So the children in the experimental group will use more words to communicate in the parent-child free play session after treatment because the measurement context, which features a parent that is more uniformly responsive, elicits more communication. It may seem unbelievable that subtle changes in parent behavior can have very large but temporary effects on an important child behavior like language or intentional communication, but we have lots of evidence that they can and do. For example, Louie and Dawson showed that imitating a child with autism elicited more coordinated attention to object and person than engaging in parallel play with the child during a single assessment visit. The order of the sessions was counterbalanced, and the effect size was large. There are many demonstrations like this one. Some people might argue that it is important to use parent-child interaction sessions to measure child language outcomes. This is because the parent-child interaction context is frequently occurring and emotionally critical. In other words, it's the primary context that young children find themselves in. Even if improvements in the treatment group are the result of contextual effects and not generalized changes in ability, at least the treatment has served to enhance the primary context in which children use language. However, a child that communicates only with their mother can be considered selectively mute, and because it cannot be exhibited across interaction partners, their communication improvement is not a very functional outcome. Other people argue that initial improvements in this very limited context may bode well for future generalization and maintain skill development. In other words, the treatment facilitated the first step in development, and those improvements will cascade across other interaction partners and skills. Unfortunately, we cannot assume that such generalization or future development will occur. In fact, many studies attest to the fact that treatment effects do not typically result in generalized and maintained communication behavior change. Other people think that child behaviors should only be measured in natural contexts with familiar communication partners. They might say that this is the most valid way to measure communication. Even so, it's still possible to measure our outcome of interest with familiar but untrained communication partners, such as fathers or siblings, and avoid introducing this threat into our results. So what should we do if we encounter this problem in our research? If we're using a parent-child interaction session as the primary outcome of interest when the treatment is parent-implemented, then we can measure the outcome in at least one session in which the activity or the interaction style is very different from that of treatment. Or we could measure the outcome with a familiar but untrained interaction partner. For example, perhaps the mother receives the language intervention training, but the father or a sibling comes in to participate in the language sample. Most importantly, even if we measure outcomes in multiple contexts, if we only observe changes that occur as a result of treatment in measures taken from parent-child interactions, then those results should be interpreted as dyadic, context-bound changes rather than generalized changes in children's abilities. If the goal of the experiment was to change children's trait-like abilities rather than their context-bound tendencies, then we have to acknowledge this limitation and call for future studies which demonstrate the effectiveness of the intervention on generalized skills. This issue isn't relevant only to early childhood research. It can be problematic when experimentally testing various education interventions. For example, a study which tests a peer-mediated intervention to train social skills in children with autism might encounter the same problem. So it's important for all educational researchers to consider this issue when planning experiments.